So I do want to dig a little bit into the concept of virtue and what you mean by that, because it's a word that people use a lot, but I think sometimes, especially when we talk about like women's virtue, it can sound a little bit like, ooh, like, tighten your corset, and like, let's go back to this idea where, women were these sort of like angels in the house. And so what do you mean by virtue in this kind of robust philosophical sense? And then why do we need feminism to reconnect with that idea of virtue?
Yeah, and so the best place to go, of course, is to Mary Wollstonecraft. And I start with her in the book and kind of, had read her early on as a women's studies student. But I think I read excerpts of her. And so just read her the way most people do, which is, she wanted co-equal education. She wanted entry into the professions. She wanted kind of rights in marriage. And so we've attained all those things. So why should we care about Wollstonecraft anymore? And what's fascinating, if you read actually a Vindication of the Rights of Women in full, you see that there's this really deep kind of moral and philosophical grounding to her understanding of all that. And so importantly, she's writing in the late 18th century. And so she is in conversation with all sort of different Enlightenment figures, but most especially, I would say, Jean-Jacques Rousseau. And so in Rousseau's Emile, he puts together this view of women. He has a chapter on Sophie. So Emile is his book on education. And in the book, he wants to find a fitting a woman for his Emile. And so he writes this whole chapter on Sophie. And who is Sophie but a woman of this feminine virtue that you're talking about? So she's meek and submissive. She manipulates with her sexual power. And she is able to kind of govern man in some sense by her chastity. And so for Rousseau, like so many others, and sometimes this sneaks into Christianity, certainly within kind of the Victorian period, there's this understanding that yes, like women's virtue is their chastity or their purity or their modesty. And so Wollstonecraft is going at that straight on. And so, again, it's this logic of virtue that she uses as she says, both men and women are rational creatures. And so, yes, they have different bodies, but that they're endowed with this ennobling capacity to reason. And I'll quote her here because I think it's just beautiful. She says, to rise in excellence by the exercise of powers implanted for that purpose. And so what she wants to do is open up all of the virtues to women. She says, you're basically... you, Rousseau, and all the, the culture that follows him is basically keeping women, kind of not just like trapped in the home. I mean, it's not really, she sees the domestic sphere as really the seedbed of the virtue that's important for development for children, for man and woman, but then also for the entire public sphere. So domesticity for her is a beautiful thing and really the kind of center of civilization, I guess I would say. But virtue is something that both men and women ought to, work toward by fulfilling their duties, because it is their end to imitate God as God's goodness and God's wisdom. And so she sees benevolence as like kind of, thinking of others, living one's life in order to serve others as the highest of virtues, but for both men and women. And so because they have this shared rational soul, they have this common purpose, which is develop wisdom and virtue. But because of their sex differences, they, may kind of obtain or kind of manifest virtue in different ways, right? Because of their different duties, you would say, like motherhood and fatherhood. Of course, virtue is going to manifest in different ways. But that doesn't mean, she talks about men and women may have different duties, but they ought to live or fulfill those duties with human principles, right? Which is kind of open to all of us, which is virtue. So what are those virtues? Some of them are, sort of virtues like the classical virtues of justice, temperance, which we would call like self-mastery, self-discipline, which for her was key because she understood passions when they run wild can, make us into kind of just animals. Like we need to have self-mastery, self-discipline in order to really let reason govern our passions, so that we can really be free. I mean, that's her understanding of freedom. Much different understanding from the moderns. But then also, of course, patience, but then also chastity, modesty. She doesn't want to push away chastity, modesty. She just says men are responsible for chastity too. This is not just a woman's thing. In fact, she says, without knowing anything about testosterone at that point, just observing that men are far more libidinous, right? So they're more, they have greater sort of libidos, which we know to be true because of testosterone. And so they actually have a greater call toward chastity to govern themselves, to govern their sexual appetites in order that they may really be free to love a woman for who she is as a person and not just, for her sex appeal. So I would say that's her full kind of understanding of virtue is really, she would agree with the ancients that virtue is really, it's really kind of developed reason, because to live in accordance with reason is to live in accordance with that highest part of us, which is that which imitates God in his, wisdom. And so she doesn't kind of use the participatory kind of language that like the medievals would, but it's very much kind of an imitation of God, who is the singular standard for goodness and virtue. And so that's who we should be imitating, both men and women.